I never expected to become the owner of a 1952 Ferguson tractor that day. The autumn air was crisp as I walked through the equipment yard, boots crunching on fallen leaves. Old machinery sat in neat rows like forgotten soldiers waiting for their next assignment. I'd come to bid on a small hay baler, nothing more. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the farmyard as he moved from lot to lot. When he reached the Ferguson, painted in faded red with rust spots blooming like flowers on its hood, I noticed something the other bidders didn't. The serial number caught my eye. 528394. My grandfather had owned that exact model, same year, and he'd always said the 52 series was built to last forever. The engine coughed and wheezed when they tried to start it for demonstration. Black smoke belched from the exhaust, and it shuddered like a dog shaking off rain. Most folks shook their heads and walked away. The auctioneer's enthusiasm waned as he called for opening bids. "Do I hear 500? Silence. 400? More silence. 300 to get us started? My hand went up before my brain could stop it. $300 seemed reasonable for what looked like a decent frame and transmission, even if the engine needed. No other hands followed mine. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the blue cap. As I signed the paperwork, an elderly man in overalls approached me. His weathered face carried a knowing smile that made me wonder if I'd just made the best decision of my life, or the worst mistake I'd ever made at an auction. Loading the Ferguson onto my trailer required the auction house's forklift. The tractor's dead weight settled heavily, making my pickup's suspension groan in protest. I'd brought chains and straps, but the loader operator just shook his head and secured it his way. Professional courtesy, he called it. The drive home gave me time to second-guess my impulse purchase. $300 wasn't devastating, but it wasn't pocket change either. My wife Sarah would have questions, especially since we'd agreed to be more careful with money after the lean harvest season. Back at my farm, I positioned the trailer near my workshop. The Ferguson looked even more tired in the familiar surroundings of my own place. Paint peeled from the hood like sunburned skin, and the seat had more tears than a funeral service. The steering wheel wobbled in my hands as I tried to guide it down the ramps using the trailer winch. Once on solid ground, I walked around my new acquisition slowly. The rear tires held air but showed their age in cracked sidewalls and worn treads. The front end seemed straight, and the three-point hitch appeared functional. Under the hood, the engine block looked solid despite the external rust. I tried the key one more time, hoping for a miracle. The starter cranked enthusiastically, but the engine only coughed twice before falling silent again. At least the electrical system worked. The headlights came on strong, and all the gauges showed signs of life. My neighbor's dog started barking from across the fence. Through the evening shadows, I could see Jim Peterson standing in his driveway, watching me with obvious curiosity. We'd been neighbors for 15 years, and he'd never shown much interest in my farming activities before. That night at dinner, Sarah listened to my explanation with the patience she'd developed over 25 years of marriage. Saturday morning arrived with frost covering everything like nature's own primer coat. I spent the first hour after sunrise in the workshop, gathering tools and setting up a proper workspace around the Ferguson. Coffee steamed in the cold air as I began my investigation. The engine oil came out black as midnight, thick enough to spread on toast. I'd expected that. The hydraulic fluid looked better, amber-colored and clean. Someone had maintained at least part of this machine properly. The radiator held murky water that smelled like old pennies, but no antifreeze. I pulled the spark plugs one by one, examining each like a detective studying evidence. 2 were fouled with carbon, but the electrodes looked decent. The third plug told a different story. Oil coated the threads, suggesting worn rings or valve guides. The fourth plug was nearly new, as if someone had started repairs and never finished. The air filter housing contained what looked like a small ecosystem of dust, chaff, and dead insects. I dumped it all into a bucket, making a mental note to buy a replacement element in town. Underneath all that debris, the carburetor looked surprisingly clean. My investigation was interrupted by the sound of boots on gravel. Jim Peterson appeared at my workshop door, coffee mug in hand, and genuine curiosity written across his face. "Morning, neighbor. Heard you picked up some iron at the auction yesterday." I nodded toward the Ferguson. $300 of questionable judgment, according to my wife. Jim walked slowly around the tractor, his experienced eye taking in details I'd probably missed. He ran his hand along the rear axle housing, checked the tire pressure by pressing his boot against the sidewalls, and peered under the hood with the focused attention of someone who understood machinery. "You know what you've got here?" he asked finally, his voice carrying an odd tone I couldn't quite identify. Jim's question hung in the morning air like fog over a pond. I wiped my hands on an old rag, studying his expression. In all our years as neighbors, I'd never seen him show this level of interest in anything mechanical. "It's a '52 Ferguson," I answered. "Pretty rough shape, but the bones seem solid." He nodded slowly, still examining the tractor like an appraiser evaluating a painting. "Mind if I take a closer look at that serial number?" I pointed to the stamped numbers on the frame. Jim pulled reading glasses from his shirt pocket and leaned in close. His weathered finger traced each digit carefully. 528394. When he straightened up, his expression had changed completely. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, didn't mean to cuss. It's just, this is quite a coincidence." "How so?" Jim removed his cap and ran fingers through thinning gray hair. "My father bought a Ferguson new in 1952. Same model, same everything. Worked this land with it for 32 years before arthritis got too bad for him to farm. Had to sell it when he moved to town." The implications started clicking into place. This land could mean the entire township, but given our proximity, there was a good chance this very tractor had worked the fields visible from where we stood. "You remember the serial number from 60 years ago?" I asked. Jim smiled. "Dad made me memorize it for insurance purposes. Drilled it into my head. 528394. Said a man should know his equipment like he knows his own name." He paused, studying the Ferguson with new intensity. "This isn't just any old tractor, friend. If I'm right, this machine helped feed 3 generations of Peterson families." The morning suddenly felt warmer despite the frost still clinging to the workshop windows. What I'd thought was a simple equipment purchase was becoming something much more significant. Jim's revelation changed everything about how I saw the old Ferguson. What had been just another piece of used equipment an hour ago now carried the weight of family history and local heritage. I found myself looking at the worn seat with new respect, imagining Jim's father spending countless hours in that exact spot. "Dad bought it from Hendrick's Implement in town," Jim continued, his voice taking on the tone people use when sharing cherished memories. "Cost him $800 new, which was serious money in 1952. Mom wasn't happy about the expense, but Dad said good equipment pays for itself." I could picture the scene. A young farmer making a significant investment in his future, betting that modern machinery would help him build something lasting. The Ferguson represented more than transportation or power. It was a symbol of hope and progress. "What happened when your dad sold it?" I asked. Jim's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the thing. I'm not entirely sure. Dad's memory wasn't what it used to be by then. I handled most of the sale through a dealer, but I never followed up on where it went. Always regretted not buying it myself, keeping it in the family." He walked around to the back of the tractor and pointed to a small dent in the rear fender. "I remember when that happened. I was maybe 12 years old, helping Dad move hay bales. Got distracted watching a red-tailed hawk and backed into a fence post. Dad wasn't angry, just said it gave the tractor character. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and warming the air." Jim seemed lost in memories, his eyes focused on something beyond the present moment. "Would you mind if I helped you get her running again?" he asked suddenly. "I mean, I understand if you'd rather work alone, but I knew this machine when she was young. Might be useful to have around." The offer surprised me, but it made perfect sense. Who better to help restore the Ferguson than someone who remembered it in its prime? Jim's offer to help felt like a gift I hadn't expected. In our 15 years as neighbors, we'd maintained the polite distance that rural folks often keep. Friendly waves across the fence, occasional conversations about weather or crops, but nothing deeper. This old tractor seemed to be changing that dynamic. "I'd appreciate the help," I told him honestly. "Especially from someone who knows her history." His smile was genuine. Dad always said the Ferguson was the most reliable piece of equipment he ever owned. Started every morning, worked all day, never complained. The only reason he sold it was because his hands couldn't grip the steering wheel anymore. We spent the next hour developing a plan. Jim suggested starting with the basics. Fresh fluids, clean filters, new spark plugs, and a thorough inspection of all systems. His knowledge of the specific model surprised me. He remembered maintenance schedules, common problems, and even the location of grease fittings I hadn't noticed. The hydraulic system on these is bulletproof, he explained, pointing to various components. But the engine needs good compression to run right. Dad rebuilt this one around 1967, so it's got maybe 40 years on the overhaul. By noon, we'd created a comprehensive restoration plan. Nothing too ambitious. We weren't trying to make it show quality, just reliable and functional. Jim offered to cover half the part's cost, saying it was the least he could do for the chance to work on his father's old machine again. As we broke for lunch, I realized something had shifted in our... The Ferguson wasn't just bringing mechanical challenges, it was creating a bridge between two neighbors who'd never taken the time to really... "Tomorrow's Sunday," Jim said as he prepared to leave. "How about we start Monday morning? I'll bring Dad's old service manual. Kept it all these years, thinking someday I might need it again." I watched him walk home across the field, understanding that this project was about much more than fixing an old tractor. Monday morning brought clear skies and Jim's enthusiastic knock on my workshop door. He arrived carrying a worn leather satchel that looked almost as old as the Ferguson itself. Inside, he produced the original operator's manual, service bulletins, and maintenance records dating back to 1952. "Dad kept everything," Jim explained, spreading the documents on my workbench like treasure maps. "Every oil change, every repair, every modification. Look at this." He even noted which fields the tractor worked each season. The maintenance log revealed meticulous care spanning 3 decades. Oil changes every 50 hours. Grease fittings serviced religiously. Seasonal tune-ups performed with clockwork precision. The Ferguson hadn't just been equipment to Jim's father. It had been a trusted partner deserving of respect and proper maintenance. We started with the engine, following procedures outlined in the faded manual. The compression test revealed what I'd suspected. 3 cylinders showed good numbers, but the 4th was weak. Not catastrophic, but enough to explain the rough running and excessive oil consumption. Dad mentioned this problem in his last entries, Jim noted, pointing to handwritten notes in the margins. Planned to rebuild the engine that winter, but his arthritis got worse. Probably why he decided to sell instead. The carburetor came apart easily, revealing surprisingly clean internal components. Someone had rebuilt it recently, though not necessarily correctly. Several adjustment screws were set wrong, and the float seemed heavy with old fuel residue. Jim handled each component with the familiarity of someone who'd performed these tasks before. His hands moved confidently through procedures I was learning for the first time. The difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience became obvious as we worked together. By evening, we'd made solid progress. The engine bay looked cleaner. New fluids filled all reservoirs, and fresh filters were installed throughout. Tomorrow would bring the moment of truth, our first attempt to start the restored Ferguson. "Feels good to work on her again," Jim admitted as we cleaned our tools. Tuesday morning arrived with anticipation thick as morning mist. Jim appeared earlier than usual, carrying a small cooler and wearing the expression of someone about to witness something important. The Ferguson sat in the workshop exactly as we'd left it, but somehow it looked different. More hopeful, perhaps. "Brought coffee and donuts," Jim announced. Figured we'd either be celebrating or consoling ourselves. We performed one final inspection, checking connections, fluid levels, and all our previous work. Everything looked proper. The moment had arrived to discover whether our efforts would pay off or if more extensive repairs lay ahead. I climbed onto the seat that had cradled Jim's father for so many years. The key turned easily, and the starter cranked with authority. On the 3rd revolution, the engine coughed twice, then settled into a steady rumble that filled the workshop with mechanical music. "Hot damn!" Jim shouted over the engine noise, his usual reserved demeanor completely forgotten. "Listen to that! Sounds just like she did 40 years ago." The Ferguson purred with satisfaction, all 4 cylinders contributing their share to the smooth idle. I checked the gauges. Oil pressure strong, temperature normal, charging system working perfectly. After a few minutes of warm-up, I engaged the transmission and drove slowly out of the workshop. The old tractor moved with surprising grace, steering responsive and transmission shifting smoothly through all gears. We spent an hour testing every system: hydraulics, power takeoff, 3-point hitch, lights, and brakes. Everything functioned exactly as designed. Dad would be proud. Jim said quietly as we stood watching the Ferguson idle peacefully in my farmyard. She's running better now than when he sold her. The restoration had taken only 3 days, but it felt like we'd accomplished something much more significant than mechanical repair. We'd brought history back to life, honored the memory of a careful farmer, and created something that would serve faithfully for years to come. That evening, Sarah admitted she was impressed with both the tractor's transformation and the friendship developing between Jim and me. Word travels fast in rural communities, and by Thursday morning, everyone within 10 miles seemed to know about the Ferguson's resurrection. I was greasing the front wheel bearings when Jim's wife, Dorothy, appeared at the workshop door carrying fresh-baked cookies and wearing a curious expression. "Jim's been talking non-stop about that old tractor," she said, settling into my spare chair. "Haven't seen him this excited about anything in years. You've given him a real gift." The cookies were still warm, and we shared them while discussing the restoration project. Dorothy revealed details about the tractor's history that Jim hadn't mentioned. How his father had used it to clear new fields, plant the windbreak trees still standing along their property line, and pull the hay wagon during countless summer harvests. "The Ferguson was practically part of the family," she continued. "Jim learned to drive on that machine when he was barely tall enough to reach the clutch pedal." Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Jim appeared, but his usual cheerful demeanor seemed replaced by something more serious. He nodded to Dorothy, then turned his attention to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We need to talk," he said simply. Dorothy excused herself, leaving us alone with the recently restored tractor humming quietly between us. Jim removed his cap and fidgeted with the brim, a nervous habit I'd noticed during our working sessions. "I've been thinking about this for 2 days," he began slowly. "What you paid for the Ferguson at auction wasn't fair market value. The auctioneer didn't know what he had, and most folks there couldn't see past the rough appearance." I started to protest, but Jim held up his hand. "Let me finish. That tractor's worth considerably more than $300, especially now that she's running properly. I'm prepared to offer you $600, double what you paid, to buy her back." The proposal hit me like a cold wind. After all our work together, all the shared stories and growing friendship, Jim wanted to take the Ferguson home. I understood his motivation, but the offer still stung. Jim's offer hung between us like an unwelcome visitor. $600 represented a clean profit and a graceful exit from what had become an unexpectedly complicated situation. But money wasn't the only consideration anymore. The Ferguson had become something more than a mere transaction. "I need some time to think about it," I told him honestly. Jim nodded, understanding. "Of course, I'm not trying to pressure you. Just wanted you to know how I felt about it." He left me alone with the tractor and my conflicted thoughts. From a purely business perspective, his offer made perfect sense. Double my investment in less than a week wasn't a return you found every day. The Ferguson would go to someone who genuinely valued its history and would care for it properly. But walking away felt wrong somehow. The restoration project had awakened something in me I hadn't expected. A connection to the land, to the equipment that worked it, and to the generations of farmers who'd faced similar decisions. The Ferguson represented continuity in a world that seemed to change faster every year. I spent the afternoon running the tractor through various tasks around my property. She handled everything I asked with the competent reliability Jim's father had valued decades earlier. Bush hogging the back pasture, moving hay bales, pulling the manure spreader. Each job reinforced my growing appreciation for solid, dependable machinery. That evening, Sarah and I discussed Jim's proposition over dinner. Her perspective was characteristically practical. We needed the money more than we needed another piece of equipment, especially considering our existing tractor handled most farming tasks adequately. "But I can see what this means to you," she added thoughtfully. "And to Jim. Maybe there's a solution that works for everyone." Her suggestion was elegant in its simplicity. Let Jim buy the Ferguson, but arrange for me to help with maintenance and occasional projects. We'd established a partnership that didn't need to end just because ownership changed hands. The idea had merit, but something still bothered me about the whole situation. Friday morning brought unwelcome complications. I was checking the Ferguson's tire pressure when an unfamiliar pickup truck turned into my driveway. The vehicle was expensive, one of those luxury models that cost more than most people's annual, and the driver matched the truck's pretentious character. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, antique tractor dealer from the county seat. Word about the Ferguson's restoration had reached professional circles, and he'd come to make his own offer. Classic farm tractors are hot collectibles right now, Webb explained in the smooth tone of someone accustomed to making deals. Especially Ferguson's in good running condition. I'm prepared to offer $1,500 cash today. $1,500. 5 times my original investment and more than double Jim's generous proposal. The amount was genuinely tempting, representing financial breathing room Sarah and I rarely enjoyed. But Webb's aggressive approach felt wrong somehow. The tractor's not for sale, I told him. Webb's smile never wavered. Everything's for sale at the right price. How about $2,000? That's good money for an old farm tractor, even a restored one. Before I could respond, Jim appeared from the direction of his house. He'd obviously seen the strange truck and come to investigate. His expression darkened when he recognized Webb. Apparently, their paths had crossed before. "Marcus," Jim said coldly. "Should have known you'd show up once word got around." Webb's professional demeanor slipped slightly. "Hello, Jim. Just conducting business with your neighbor here. The Ferguson isn't for sale to you," Jim stated flatly. "Not at any price." The tension between the two men was palpable. Webb recovered his composure quickly, but I sensed history between them that I didn't understand. After another futile attempt to negotiate, he finally climbed back into his expensive truck and drove away. "What was that about?" I asked Jim once we were alone. Jim's jaw was still tight with anger. "Webb's a dealer who specializes in buying family tractors from folks who don't know their true value. Then he sells them to collectors for triple what he paid. And you two have history? He bought Dad's old farmall after the funeral, paid my mother a fraction of what it was worth." Jim's revelation about Webb's previous dealings cast our entire situation in a different light. I finally understood why his offer to buy the Ferguson carried such emotional weight. This wasn't about money or even nostalgia. It was about preventing family history from disappearing into the hands of strangers who would never understand its true significance. "I should have told you earlier," Jim said as we sat on my porch that evening. "When Dad died 3 years ago, Mom needed money quickly for medical bills. Webb showed up at the funeral visitation, smooth-talking his way into a deal for Dad's 1948 Farmall H. Paid her $800 for a tractor worth at least $3,000. The injustice of the situation was obvious. A grieving widow, unfamiliar with equipment values, taken advantage of by someone who specialized in such transactions. Jim's resentment was completely justified. By the time I found out what happened, Webb had already sold it to some collector in California, Jim continued. Mom lost a piece of Dad's legacy, and some stranger got a tractor they'd never appreciate properly. I understood now why finding his father's Ferguson at auction had meant so much to Jim. After losing the farmall to Webb's predatory practices, discovering the Ferguson still existed, and in the hands of a neighbor rather than a distant collector, must have felt like a second chance. "That's why I made the offer," Jim explained. "Not to take advantage of you, but to make sure the Ferguson stays where it belongs. This land, this community, these are her roots." The evening air carried the scent of honeysuckle and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, the Ferguson sat quietly in my workshop, completely unaware of the human dramas swirling around her mechanical presence. "Jim," I said finally, "I've been thinking about your offer, and I have a counter-proposal." His expression grew cautious. After the day's complications with Webb, he probably expected more bad news. "I don't want to sell the Ferguson," I continued, "but I don't want to keep her from where she belongs either. What if we shared ownership? Partners in preserving a piece of local history?" The idea had been forming in my mind all day, crystallizing into something that felt right for everyone involved. Jim's eyes widened at my suggestion of shared ownership. In all his years of farming and business dealings, he'd probably never encountered such an arrangement. Rural property law tends toward clear, simple ownership structures. You either own something or you don't. But the Ferguson's unique history seemed to call for a more creative solution. "How would that work exactly?" he asked. I'd been thinking through the practical details all afternoon. We split the expenses, maintenance, repairs, improvements. We share the work opportunities. You can use her for projects around your place. I'll use her around mine. If either of us ever decides to sell, the other gets first option at fair market value. The arrangement made sense from multiple perspectives. Jim would regain access to his father's tractor without the financial burden of full ownership. I'd keep the connection to the Ferguson without feeling guilty about separating Jim from family history. Most importantly, The tractor would remain in our community rather than disappearing into some collector's climate-controlled barn. It's unconventional, Jim admitted slowly, but it feels right somehow. We shook hands on the agreement, then spent another hour working out details. We'd document everything properly. Rural partnerships can go wrong quickly without clear understanding of responsibilities and expectations. But the basic concept felt solid. Shared stewardship of something that belonged to both of us in different ways. The next morning, Dorothy arrived with fresh coffee and her husband's grin. Jim hasn't stopped talking about your partnership idea. It's perfect. You both get what you want without anyone feeling cheated. Word of our unusual arrangement spread through the community with typical rural efficiency. Most folks thought it was a sensible solution, though a few old-timers shook their heads at the complications of joint ownership. But practical wisdom often develops in unexpected ways, and our Ferguson partnership seemed to be working exactly as intended. By midweek, we'd established routines that felt natural. Jim handled morning inspections and basic maintenance, drawing on his lifetime of experience with the specific model. I focused on operational tasks, using the Ferguson for actual farming work that kept her exercised and purposeful. The tractor seemed to approve of the arrangement. 3 months later, our Ferguson partnership had evolved into something neither Jim nor I had anticipated. What began as a simple shared ownership arrangement had grown into a friendship that enriched both our lives. We worked together on projects throughout the community, lending the restored tractor to neighbors who needed temporary help with heavy tasks. The Ferguson had become something of a local celebrity. Folks would stop by just to see the auction tractor that had generated so much interest. Jim loved telling the story of his father's careful maintenance, while I enjoyed describing the restoration process that brought her back to life. Together, we'd created something more valuable than the sum of our individual efforts. Webb made one more attempt to purchase the Ferguson, raising his offer to $2,500. We declined politely but firmly. Some things aren't for sale at any price, and our partnership had proven that shared stewardship could work better than individual ownership when the right people and circumstances come together. The tractor earned her keep throughout the growing season. We used her for everything from brush hogging pastures to powering the old threshing machine at the County Heritage Festival. Each task reinforced our belief that equipment should be used, not just preserved as static artifacts. As autumn returned and the anniversary of that fateful auction approached, I reflected on how much had changed. A $300 impulse purchase had generated friendships, partnerships, and community connections I never could have imagined. The Ferguson had brought people together in ways that transcended mere ownership or mechanical restoration. Standing in my workshop on a crisp October morning, watching Jim perform the weekly maintenance routine he'd learned from his father decades earlier, I understood that some purchases are about much more than money. Sometimes you buy a piece of equipment and discover you've acquired a piece of history, a partnership, and a deeper connection to the community that surrounds you. The Ferguson started on the first turn of the key, just as she had every morning since our restoration. Reliable, dependable, ready for whatever work the day might bring. Some things never change, and that's exactly as it should be. Thank you for listening to this story of an old tractor, an unexpected friendship, and the power of community connection. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories from rural life. Until next time, keep your equipment running and your neighbors close.